Thank you, Dr. Benedict, for joining us this morning to continue with our discussions on Islam and capitalism. One of the questions arising from the last session was, well, what about the female entrepreneurs? Dr. Kohler will hopefully cover this today. But before I hand over to Dr. Kohler, I just want to make or share an observation that without people like Salama, Aisha, Maymuna, Habiba, and other distinguished female luminaries, Islam would simply not exist as we know it today. It's just a fact. Their fatwas became the cornerstone of Islamic jurisprudence. Aisha in particular is well known for her legal rulings, and her teachings underpin Islamic jurisprudence. This was a tradition that continued so far as this was a tradition that continued. So, for example, in the 5th century, we find in Central Asia people like Karima al-Marwaziyya, people from all the corners of the Islamic world would come and sit with her and listen to her. In recent times, there seems to be a resurgence in this tradition, but more needs to be done. So what about business then? As a team, we're honored to work for some truly inspirational Muslim female business women. In fact, the Islamic finance team at the firm is 70% female. Dr. Kohler will hopefully explore how they find themselves in a rich line of female entrepreneurs going back to the dawn of Islam. So Dr. Kohler, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Mohammed, and I'm delighted to be here, and it's wonderful to have this opportunity to speak about early Islam and civil society in early Islam, especially in respect of business. What I'd like to speak about today is about the position of females in early Islamic society. And the best way to contrast their position is with that of European or other societies of the time is to mention one or two other sources which tell you about the position of women in other places that correspond in terms of their historical development. The first place I'd like to look at is ancient Greece. Most of us who have encountered ancient Greek literature are familiar with the Greek poetess Sappho. What's remarkable about that rich tradition of Greek letters is that in ancient Greece, she is the only prominent female in that list. And I'd like to give an example about women in business as they appeared to ancient Greeks by citing the Greek historian Herodotus, a well-traveled man who visited most of the known world of his era, the 5th century before Christ, and who noticed when he was in Egypt that on Egyptian marketplaces, you saw women engaged in selling goods and merchandise. Now, if that had been common in Greece, he wouldn't have pointed out as being something very peculiar about Egyptian ways of life. So there are two examples, Sappho and Herodotus, which tell us something about the fact that women in ancient Greece were very much inconspicuous. I'm now moving across to the Middle East, and I look at the Old Testament. You look at the Old Testament, you have a rich gallery of prophets. Of the many, many prophets mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, only Deborah is a prophet who happens also to be female. So there are very few women in the tradition of religious history. Let's now move on further south. Let's move to Arabia. What are some of the indicators of the position and the place of women in society? And there are three examples: literacy and literature, and the other two are activities in trade, and the third is the right to own property. So let me start with literature and literacy. Pre-Islamic Islam had a very strong and prominent and distinguished tradition of poetry. You may not, but if you're not, you have missed something. If you're interested in poetry at all, there's a collection of 7 great pre-Islamic poets, the Mu'allaqat. And the Mu'allaqat poetry was appreciated very much, especially from the 1700s onward in England, in all over Europe. The German poet Goethe was very appreciative of, I think he was one of the first critics of early Arabic poetry, and promulgated criticism and literary criticism of the mu'allaqat. But Arabs already before Islam had a very distinguished tradition of literature. And Muhammad's contemporaries included a number of poets, of whom I will single out one, Tumadir al-Khanza. Al-Khanza was known to Muhammad, moved in his social circle. He praised her profusely, and some of her, there must have been more, and her poetry still exists in and can be looked up. But what's unusual here is that you have poetry, a strong tradition of poetry, and what's unusual is that you also have a woman who is remembered as a poet. I find it implausible that she would have been the only one. There would have been others. But now let's contrast that with the European tradition at the time. In the 600, or in fact throughout the entire Middle Ages, there are very, very few female poets. There's one a few centuries later. Hildegard von Bingen is one example. There must have been some others, but they are very, very few. So to consider that in the 600s there was a female poet still written, whose work is still extant today, tells you something about the level of literacy amongst women in the Arabic and Islamic world. You may, from the distance of 1,500 years, think it's not so unusual for a woman to be writing poetry, since after all, most people, when they write, sooner or later might be writing some literature. But the very fact that a woman would be capable of reading and writing was very unusual. Let me contrast the experience of the capability of women to write in the Muslim world with contemporary Europe at the time. Charlemagne, who was crowned emperor in the year 800 and revived the Roman Empire, Charlemagne is known to have been illiterate. Charlemagne and the Carolingian Renaissance is remembered, amongst other reasons, because Charlemagne hired a brain trust. He hired people who knew how to read and write. He himself did not. So it's unusual for females to have been writing, considering that even in the highest ranks of officialdom in Christian Europe at the time, reading and writing was not a widely spread skill. We know that two of Muhammad's wives were able to, possibly three, knew how to read, Hafsa being one of them, and she will be mentioned later on. So this was my first point, the position, the place of women in the world of literature and of learning and of poetry. I'm now moving on to the second point, to mercantile activities. I had earlier mentioned that the Greek visitor to Egypt, Herodotus, was surprised to see women working in marketplaces as sellers in marketplaces. Women also appeared in commerce in the Arabic world. The great-grandfather of Muhammad, Hashim ibn Abmanaf, he died in the 5th century. He had a wife, Selma, who was an independent trader. He was passing from Mecca to Gaza and back and met her in Medina, where she lived. And she was a trader in Medina. And significantly, she also continued as a trader after she married Hashim. So Muhammad had a great-grandmother who was a trader. Muhammad also, as he grew up, he was orphaned and he had to pay his way in the world, had to make a living for himself. His first investor in a caravan venture was Khadija, whom he later married. Khadija was a very wealthy lady in Mecca, and she was a professional investor, and that's how she made that was her business. Muhammad and Khadija were married for 25 years, and Khadija continued in her profession until she died, which was in 619. So for 25 years, Muhammad was married, was monogamous, and his wife was active as a trader. My third point will be about property rights of women, but I'll set that aside for a moment. What I have shown just now is that Muhammad's great-grandmother was a trader and his wife was an investor. So this shows that women were active in at least some aspects of commercial life. but they were active also in others. And I will now give two examples of this. When Muhammad moved to Medina, I'd mentioned that one of his activities there was to set up a market. And I'd mentioned earlier or previously that markets in the Islamic world had a market supervisor, a market regulator, the mutazib, and the Medinan mutazib was female. So market supervision and market regulation was in the hands of a female official. And I'll mention the second example. I had pointed out that when the first waqf was created by Umar ibn Khattab, later to become the second caliph, Umar ibn Khattab vested all of his personal property in a waqf. And I had mentioned that a waqf has an administrator called a mutawali. The mutawali for Umar's waqf was Hafsa. Hafsa had a dual relationship with Umar and with Muhammad. She was the daughter of Umar ibn Khattab, and she was the wife of Muhammad. So Muhammad had one wife, Khadija, who was a professional investor, and another wife, Hafsa, who was the administrator and the manager of a waqf. So this demonstrates that women were active across an entire range of commercial activities. If you're active in commercial activities, you are going to find yourself dealing with property, and you need to have the rights to property. I'll mention two examples of the rights to property, first in trade and secondly in matrimony. The two examples, the first one is connected to Khadija. It may sound unsurprising that an investor could be female to us in the world today, but in a distant time and place, such as Arabia, it would have been very unusual. In fact, in the Arabic world, it was common for women to dispose of property in their own name and by their own right. And again, just to show how this distant time and place was very different from contemporary experience elsewhere, compare that to European experience at the time. It was not common. It was, in fact, was impossible for a woman at the time to be active in trade. If you look at medieval Christianity, if you look at Roman antiquity, if you look at Greek antiquity, you do not encounter women active in the business of trade. And in fact, since they were not active in trade, they had virtually no property rights. The emancipation of women in respect of property rights is a development which took place over centuries in Europe. I mentioned property in respect of trade. I'll now just move on to property in respect of matrimony. Divorce was quite common in Middle Eastern societies. It goes back to, as you know if you've read the books of Moses, you know that he had prescriptions about how divorce was to be handled and the consequences of divorce. In the Arabic world, already pre-Islam, it was common for prospective husbands to pay a dowry called bridal money to the family of the prospective wife. And this was kept in care of the bride's family, and in the eventuality of a divorce was there to safeguard her financial interests and protect her future. In effect, bridal money was a form of insurance policy and a form of alimony in case of divorce. You'll see that this was not unique to Arabic or Islamic culture. You'll have similar stories from the Bible. If you remember Jacob, whose father-in-law, Laban, who married two of Laban's daughters, Leah and Rebecca, you may remember when he left Laban because he felt he had been ill-treated and his father-in-law Laban was in breach of contract. His wives complained that their dowry had been used up by Laban and that he could not reclaim it. So it was a Middle Eastern custom across societies and across faiths for bridal monies to be paid by the prospective husband to his in-laws, who kept it in safekeeping for the eventuality of divorce. So as regards my third point regarding property rights held and property held by women, I gave an example of Khadija, who was an investor and who had property of her own, and who invested in Muhammad's first venture, who in fact she set him up in business. And I gave an example from matrimonial regulations in the Arabic world. I realize the topic that I've covered is a very, very wide field, but the main point I wanted to bring that to delineate the contours of the place of women in society by contrasting the place of women in Islamic and Arabic society with the place of women in other societies. So I pointed out the scarce evidence of conspicuous female presence in ancient Greece. I pointed out we only know of Sappho. I pointed out that in the Old Testament, the only female prophet is Deborah. And I then went on to contrast the position of women in society in the Western world with that of women in Arabic world by pointing out that the prominent poetess, Tumanir al-Khanza, pointed out that they were capable of reading, that women were educated to a standard where they were literate, could read and write, pointed out that this was unusual in Europe at the time, and then went on to speak about the position of women in economics and in business, as investors, as was Khadija, or as managers of a waqf, as was Hafsa, and then went on to mention the property rights of women after divorce when they were entitled to retain the bridal money that had been paid over on marriage. In closing, all I can say is what the best way to visualize what the place of women in society at the time is to contrast them with contemporaneous traditions and the place of literacy and of mercantile world and of property rights in contemporary Europe. And you can see that Muslims, Arabs, and women were ahead of where our Europeans stood at the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kohler. That was insightful. Can I open up the floor for questions? I've got a question. I've got an observation and a question. Just as an observation, I've just been sort of reading in the background that the first university, the first degree conferring university was set up by a woman, someone by the name of Fatima al-Fihri, which is interesting and not surprising really. Well, my question really is perhaps a more serious one. I'm just quoting from the Quran, and do not kill your children for fear of poverty. We gave them sustenance and yourselves too. Surely to kill them is a great wrong. And that's obviously talking about, in particular, female infanticide, which before the advent of Islam existed. And it existed in communities outside Muslim communities throughout the ages. And really, I'd be quite interested to hear your sort of views in terms of comparison with that quite harsh edict, because the Quran talks about that a number of occasions in very harsh language, understandably. It would just be useful to get your sort of insight into that compared to perhaps other cultures or what other cultures were doing then and then afterwards as well, really.
Oh, well, Mohammed, we now live in for the last few weeks, we realize that public health officials and public health regulations can have very severe consequences for communities, and that balancing the rights of a community to survive and of individuals to survive, and the trade-off between the two is something that we now encounter on the op-ed pages of all the broadsheets day after day, and these issues that are being raised are extremely contentious. So it's simply because we live in a society which has made such progress and which is so wealthy and so comfortable uh, it's only now that we begin to understand what it must have been like living in eras that are long ago lived in under much harsher conditions. And public health in societies where nutrition is not very good, where the climate is inclement, where life expectancy isn't very high, and where epidemics were recurred again and again and had terrible consequences. And we know now that we see how difficult it is to forecast an epidemic, what it must have meant to cultures 1,500 years ago to forecast public health and requirements, and the imposition of rulings and guidelines that were very tough, inhumane by our standards, were quite common. You mentioned the fact that in pre-Islamic Arabia, supernumerary children were killed. They were buried. They were buried shortly after birth. This sounds horrendous to us now, but it was not uncommon in ancient societies. Spartans in ancient Greece, for example, sifted newborn babies and determined which ones had a good chance of survival, and those that did not were left to their fate. It seems incredible to us today that in the high standards of humanity that ancient Greek culture promulgated, that ancient Greeks didn't really care for people who were ill or who were sick. In ancient Greece, if you got sick, yes, you were lucky if there was a doctor to treat you, but if there wasn't one, nobody thought it was a social obligation to look after you. Societies were indifferent. Well, maybe they weren't indifferent. Maybe they simply said, this is something that is unavoidable. But the public health measures imposed on those who were ill and on those members of society who were frail and on children whose chances of survival were deemed very poor by today's standards seem incomprehensible, but they were common at the time. And as you pointed out, Muhammad changed that, as he did many other he was very directive about many aspects of civil society, and one of those was that he forbade infanticide. You're absolutely correct to point that out. And that made him, in that respect, he was you could speak of Muhammad as a public health reformer. Incidentally, since we're speaking of public health, a mutazib was not only responsible for regulating markets, he was also responsible for regulating public health. For example, if animals were sold on markets, butchered animals, he could inspect the butcher's practices. Because for obvious reasons, if meat was not treated the right way, contaminated meat could poison people who bought it. So a mutazib was responsible for what today we would call for food standards as well as for trading standards. It was not thought to be two distinct jobs and two distinct spheres. So I hope that answers your question about public health.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I just had one question, really. In your research, did you come across any examples of where females from the Arab world and even the early Muslim world interacted with, the non-Muslim counterparts, and what the reaction was from those nations having that interaction with a female, which they probably weren't so accustomed to in those days? Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you, Afsar. Well, where I am able to provide you with a response is in respect of waqfs, because since women had property, women could also invest in a waqf. Muhammad just mentioned an educational establishment, a university established by a female donor. So women were allowed to set up their own waqfs. This is pretty unusual because when you by inference, if a woman in Christendom did not have any property, a woman in Christendom also could not make any endowments. So the waqfs that existed in the medieval world and in Palestine were something that were new to Europeans who went there, such as the Knights Templar and the Franciscans who went back and set up waqfs of their own. And the fact that women were allowed to set up waqfs would have been something they would have considered very unusual. There was no corresponding analogous experience or custom in Europe, in Christendom at the time. Now, you mentioned specifically women trading in business. Would they have encountered Christians or non-Muslims in the business world? My understanding of female investors, females who invested in waqfs, is that they would have been investing in the waqf, and that the managers, who were caravan traders who would be traveling, the traveling caravan traders, would have been male. I am aware that Abu Sufyan, the opponent of Muhammad in Mecca, that his wife Hind, who is also an example in another respect, I'll mention that in a minute, she was a trader. She was a caravan trader. Whether she traveled herself, that I can't say. But Hind is interesting, and that's the second reason Hind's commercial track record is of interest, is because Hind, when she divorced, if she became a caravan trader, that means she had her own property, she had her own she cashed in on her own dowry to set up as a trader, and was in a position to do that because that bridal money let her do that.
Thank you.
I have a question, if we've still got time.
Go ahead.
So as a Muslim woman living in today's society, trying to juggle life as a wife, a daughter, and also as a professional, did you come across any information in your research that would give us any lessons on what we can learn from the way Khadija operated? Because obviously she probably had some of the same issues that we have, but she was very successful, and people still remember her for her successes today.
Well, Khadija was very independent. I'm also aware, as Afreen, as probably you are too, she was, Muhammad was not her first husband. She had been married previously, and she was an independent woman already before she met Muhammad. She continued her career, and together they had several children. They had one boy who died very early, and they had 4 daughters. Muhammad's daughters are remembered chiefly for Fatima. But the others, Kulthum, Zainab, Rokaya, very little, not that much is known about them. I'll come back to your question in a moment. We know that they married Hafsa. They respectively married Hafsa. They married Umar and Osman, 2 of the later caliphs. So they were sons-in-law of Muhammad. But she continued. What she did is she had to combine her position as wife, investor, and mother, and she did that until she died. And their marriage lasted a good long time. Do we have any writings of Khadija? Did she write anything? Did she leave any written documents? Not that I know. I've never come across a reference to anything Khadija would have written herself. What one does know is that when Muhammad had his first visitation by the angel Gabriel, he communicated that in the first instance to Khadija rather than to anyone else. And so the first Muslims, the first converts to Islam, were in his own household, and the first convert was Khadija, who at the time, when you think of it, must have been quite mindful of the fact that not only was Muhammad stepping into a new phase of his life and of his career, but that this was also likely to cause frictions within the Meccan community and the society, and would have repercussions also on her own business. So she was very entrepreneurial in several respects. as a mother, as a wife, as a businesswoman, but also in terms of her civic commitment in backing Muhammad when he decided that he was launching on a new phase of his life. I hope that goes some way, Afreen, to answering your question.
Yeah, I think it's great. I mean, I guess she's just a fantastic role model for women everywhere, not just Muslim women, but I think just women in general. I think we can all probably learn from it. Like you said, she made some tough decisions, even if it meant it would negatively impact her business and her personal life. And I think it's great.
Yeah, Afreen. And what surprises me a bit is the prominence given to Khadija and how she handled the challenges of her life, and that by comparison, Hafsa, the wife, Umar's daughter, who Muhammad married later, and her position as the mutawali, as the manager of the first waqf, isn't really given the prominent exposure you might think, because Hafsa had to do a lot of in terms of business decisions, hers were wider because the waqf that was endowed by Umar was substantially larger than the business ventures for which Khadija was responsible. Because Umar not only had the endowment that came from after the conquest of Khaybar, but later as Khalif, he was the trustee for all of the conquests of all of the lands of what is now Iraq. That was a vast land holding. And that vast land holding was used to fund the Social Security program that Umar introduced. So Hafsa was a very important financial administrator. And when you compare the two, Khadija and Hafsa, Khadija is infinitely better known than Hafsa. And why that is, I don't know.
It's interesting. I wonder if it's something to do with the timing. So when Khadija entered into Muhammad's life compared to when Hafsa did, but it's interesting.
Yes, no, I wouldn't know. The other female member of his family who's very well known, of course, is Fatima, his daughter, the wife of Ali. And there are various. She is the only one of whom I know that an individual biography has been written. There was a professor at one of the American universities, Nabia Abbott, Abbott, and she wrote a biography of Fatima. It was published sometime in the 1950s. I know there's another one has been published in the 1990s. But the biographies of the other wives of Muhammad, I've also read up about those, but they were written by a 19th century Orientalist, Sprenger. But otherwise, there are very few biographies of the women in Muhammad's wider family. We do know that after he died, since they had their own property and they possessed their own the homes where they lived, that some of them engaged in property transactions and sold their property and moved into larger homes.
Great, thank you.
So just one last one, if I may.
Go ahead.
So just out of interest, do we see a shift outside of the Muslim world? And maybe this merits a fourth lecture. But outside of the Muslim world, is there a sort of shift towards more female entrepreneurs? And if so, what was the sort of earliest example of that was recorded outside of the Muslim world?
Who are the first female entrepreneurs outside the world of Islam? Well, I'm just downloading my memory. Who would I consider the first female entrepreneurs? We do see women active in business in their capacity as heads of state. Queen Elizabeth I gave license for monopolies. I think she and Walter Raleigh they got along very well for a while, but then after a while didn't get along very well at all. I think he had monopolies conferred on him when they got along well, and I think those monopolies were cancelled when they stopped getting along with each other. But Queen Elizabeth I certainly had a good mind, a good mind on, was quite aware of the importance of commercial concessions, and was a business politician. I think we'd call it now, we've got a trade politician, a trade negotiator, I guess is what we would say. So she's an early example. But your query is, when did women set up in business for themselves to sell something on their own, to start their own company, or partner in their own law firm or some such thing? I'm unaware. I'd have to think. I take a pass on that. I do think that women, when they came in their capacity as monarch, came in touch with financial issues, as was inevitable. They became quite astute, and you see them taking on that responsibility and taking that into their sphere of activities from the very beginning. So one might say that if conditions need to be created for a woman to take an active part in business, and then she will act the way any other entrepreneur would. I might not have been as clear as I would have liked to be as regards property rights. To be an entrepreneur, you need property to set up. And women in the Western world did not have the right to own property until comparatively recently. This takes me far outside any field that I've researched myself. But my understanding is that under common law, a married woman didn't have any property rights. Her property rights were very restricted until very, very recently. And by very recently, I mean the Victorian era. So it wouldn't be surprising that women were not active in business in Western Europe because they had no property to be active in business with.
Thank you very much.
No, not at all, Afsar. And you mentioned earlier, how did Europeans respond to see that the presence of female entrepreneurs? I know that some of the caliphs had, some of their wives were very prominent philanthropists, setting up enormous waqfs. And I don't remember the name of a caliph in particular, but how did people from the West respond to this? Well, they certainly responded to the institution of the Waqf and philanthropic endowment, but I wonder whether they registered the presence of females involved in endowing Waqfs. That probably wasn't noticed. One place where you can see many stories about women active in business is in Arabian literature. If you read 1001 Nights, which I think has 1001 characters at least mentioned, you're again and again, you're surprised by the position of women who are mentioned in their own right and active in business as in other spheres of social life.
Thank you, Benedict. That's brilliant. Just before I close up, I think in terms of biographies of Hafsa and other early women, I think they do exist. Perhaps the part of the problem is the translation into English and other European languages. And I think that sort of is a point that you made in the last session, that there's a number of great works that haven't been translated into English, and perhaps that is something that someone should endeavor to do. And the other observation was Queen Elizabeth I. We actually in our team have a life-size cutout for Queen Elizabeth I for partly that reason, actually, because she obviously also had a close alliance with the Muslim world after she was excommunicated from the Catholic Church.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So she holds a very dear place for us in our team.
Well, I can see that. I think earlier, Mohammed, in another conversation, you mentioned Jeremy Broughton, who's written about the relations between Muslims, and especially in the Ottoman era and in the Elizabethan era. I think he's also written about Shakespeare's involvement with Arabic and Muslim figures, Othello being one of them. Jeremy Broughton is, but the best thing is to ask Jeremy Broughton what he thinks.
Thank you, Benedict. Maybe that's a future Zoom discussion. But again, thank you very much for your time today. As I said, once hopefully lockdowns ease down, it would be an honor to take you out for lunch or dinner. I know I can speak on behalf of everyone. These sessions have been insightful, so thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Mohammed. It was a great opportunity, and I've really enjoyed talking.
Thank you. Bye.
Have a good weekend.
Bye.
Bye.